Good morning and welcome to another Reformed Church Center webinar. This one being on things you can do to make your congregation anti-racist. We're glad to have you with us today. I'm going to, I've said before, when we've met physically, whenever the president is in the room, we let the president talk. So the president is in the room. And so, ladies and gentlemen, Micah McCreary.
Thank you, Reverend Brum. Appreciate that introduction. Welcome to New Brunswick Theological Seminary. It is great to have you at this rich, wonderful place that many of us love so dearly. Welcome to this holy conversation that we're really looking at. How do you connect liberating leadership with deconstructing racism? How do you do that as well? And welcome to this Holy Saturday, this time between our passion and our restoration, this time where we're really still in the midst of a pandemic, but with hope of coming out of it. What are we learning? And one of the things we can learn are ways to really be better neighbors to each other. It's a biblical thing. It's a powerful thing. God bless you and welcome again to this conversation.
Earl James is the retired coordinator for the African American Black Council of the Reformed Church in America, as well as the retired coordinator for Advocacy in the RCA. He used to have a title about multicultural initiatives. Earl and I have both been around this for a while, and so I've known him as a few titles have come and gone, but he's always been doing the same thing, helping us to find and walk pathways towards living more fully into the biblical vision of shalom and the human hope of beloved community. He has worked with the denomination in increasing cultural agility and multiracial initiatives and justice. He is an RCA elder and he's married to Norma Coleman-James, who is also an RCA elder. He has 2 adult daughters, a son-in-law, and 3 grandchildren. And even though he's retired, he's spending a Saturday morning with all of us, and we're really glad for that. Ladies and gentlemen, Earl James.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, James, for that really warm introduction. I really appreciate that. It's a privilege to be able to share with you today, and it's a privilege to be able to share about this topic. It's a topic that has been close to my life, perhaps since my birth, actually. It's something my family has had to deal with, wrestle with for our time in the country. So for me, this is a closely held thing. It's a fascinating topic, and it's a challenging topic in terms of how to just equip yourself, how to equip those that you know and care for in your congregation, and how to pass on that equipment to the generations that come after you. So I feel really happy and honored and privileged to be with the Reformed Church Center and the New Brunswick Theological Seminary today to share on this topic. Just have a PowerPoint that I want to go through with you. After the PowerPoint, we will have time for questions and answers or discussion among yourselves as you go forward with that. Okay, so we're going to start with 2 critical questions. The first question is, how can my congregation and I decide whether we are dissatisfied enough with the current situations to want to make sustainable differences regarding racial equity and racial justice? That question is so critical, I want to say it again. How can my congregation and I decide whether we are dissatisfied enough with the current situation to want to make sustainable differences regarding racial equity and racial justice? That question for me is the critical one. If we are not dissatisfied enough, we'll experience many, many wonderful opportunities and we'll engage in many great experiences. But we may not have it in us to make change, to make transformation. Anti-racism is about making those sustainable differences, those long-term changes in personal, communal life together. The second critical question is, what resources can we dig into to help us as people of God to make these tangible racial equity and justice differences. Where do we make them? In the lives of our members, our neighbors, and society. What resources can we dig into to get to that? Those are the two critical questions around everything else that I'm going to share serves. Let's get into it. So in our time together this morning, I want to offer you a working definition of anti-racism. I want to highlight some of my assumptions about implementing that working definition. And let me just say that everything we do, we have assumptions in it. We bring our assumptions to it. We have biases about it. But oftentimes we don't think enough about those, and that not thinking about it, or if we do think about it, will impact the kind of outcome we get from the work that we do. So I want to highlight some of my assumptions and share those with you going forward. We have a picture about the challenges of becoming more anti-racist that we want to share. Next, provide you with some resources to assist your congregation's journey towards becoming more anti-racist. And finally, just engage in open conversation about assisting your church to become more anti-racist. There's a note that I want to bring to this. Many denominations have units or ministries that already address the biblical and theological aspects of identifying and overcoming racism. I want to refer you to those resources. In this presentation, we won't be dealing with that. In this presentation, we want to focus specifically on things you and your congregation can do. I hope that's helpful. So, working definition. I offer to you a working definition of anti-racist. Those who oppose and eradicate racist ideas wherever they encounter them, including in themselves. I offer that as a definition as opposed to a definition of racist. People who allow racist ideas to spread without opposition. I ask you to spend some time just bouncing those two ideas off on each other, but also to consider what a working definition of anti-racist is and how you can use it. Don't just declare it, don't just adopt it. Make a poster about it, put it up someplace. When you walk into a room, read it. When you're sharing with other persons, work those ideas about that definition into it. It's an active thing about exposing and about eradicating. Have it make a difference. In some meeting that you might have, start your meeting off, perhaps, with this working definition, and end your meeting to say, how did we do with regards to exposing and eradicating? Make this definition work for you. If you do that, you're taking a good step forward towards helping your congregation become more anti-racist. This working definition is one that I got from this particular website. And if you were to contact the Reformed Church Center and ask them for a copy of this PowerPoint, you'll see in that all sorts of links embedded in it where you can get easy access to some of the materials I'm going to speak about. Some of my assumptions about becoming anti-racist. Well, first one, my focus is less on how the church and its structures become anti-racist, and much, much more on how the church acts to oppose racism experienced in the everyday lives of its members, its neighbors, and society. My assumption is we don't get caught up in how do we convince the pastor, how do we convince the leadership team, how do we structure into our liturgy. There are other places and things for that. My assumption is that the true fruit of being anti-racist happens in people's everyday lives. So my assumption for our time today is, let's focus that way. We want to recognize something that's pretty critically important but maybe isn't always brought to the forefront. We all enter this discussion with very different levels of experience. Some of us may have given our lives to becoming anti-racist, and others of us may have just learned about anti-racism. Still others may be quite opposed to the idea that racism exists, so there's no need to be anti-racist. Some of us may even think that anything leading to things like diversity training is out of step, out of bounds, and has no place. Simply understand that all of us are going to enter into this discussion at different levels of experience. Here's another important one. Some of us may live in or around very racially and ethnically diverse communities, but others of us don't. That's going to affect what we do next. That's going to affect how we do what we're going to do next. We're not all starting at the same place. It's good to recognize where we live as being a factor in what we do. The fourth assumption is that we should aim for making tangible, sustainable changes in everyday life far, far more than be concerned about counting what activities we have done. For me, in my way of thinking, it is not enough to say that we did so many sermons, we did so many, went to so many workshops and seminars, we read so many books. Those things are good and fine and helpful, but that's not the goal. We should aim for sustainable, tangible changes in everyday life. This is another one that across my time, I think I have found to be a challenge, both personally, but also with people that I've worked with. Becoming anti-racist is far less about what we understand and far more about what we do to make anti-racist changes happen. I'm a male. I think males tend to live more in our heads. We tend more to say, I think, and less to say, I feel. We tend to think what in certain denominations, perhaps of more of a Northern European origin, the idea is focused on the word. It is focused on how you understand the word and less about what you do, what the deed is that follows that. Becoming anti-racist is not about how we understand and lodge in our heads what is so. It is much more about the changes that we work together to make out here. It's a big, big assumption on my part. Two more. I am of the boomer generation. There are profound generational differences between how people of the boomer and builder generations engage this matter when compared to how millennial or Generation Y or even younger Generation Z people might. There for sure are overlaps. There are for sure where we have commonalities. But we bring different sets of ideas and different sets of assumptions to the table about how the world really is. This is more than a multi-generational effort of becoming anti-racist. It must become an intergenerational one. It must become something where all the generations have their own rhythms and patterns brought to the table in particular, tangible ways that all the generations recognize we are learning from each other. Here's my final assumption that I want to share with you right now. This is a journey. We don't make as if once made you are our congregations to become anti-racist. It is much more that we assist them to become more anti-racist. It is a journey. It is not a deadline, decision point, end of the road piece. It is a journey that we're on. So let's journey that together. Okay, so much for assumptions. Let's start to get into it. When I was young, I used to keep fish, tropical fish, cold fish, that sort of thing. And one of the things that I noticed in the bowls and in the tanks that I had was there were big fish and there were little fish. And these fish were fish. They were just in there, but they tended to react a little differently to each other. Did you ever keep fish when you were young or maybe now? Have you ever observed differences between how the big fish and little fish related? I think there are some tangible lessons in that for how we can think about and plan and do going forward to becoming more anti-racist. Big fish have some assumptions. A couple of their assumptions is that big fish assume that they have rights to set standards, decisions, directions, and they have the right to lead in the setting of standards, decisions, and directions. And big fish tend to assume that the little fish will fall in line. I would say another thing that is so in real life about big fish, whether it's dealing with racism issues or sin in general, is that solutions tend to be more on the level of personal and interpersonal than other things. Well, there are also little fish, and they have assumptions too. And not only do they have assumptions, little fish exercise options when big fish pose dangers. Little fish can capitulate to big fish. They can say, oh, power-wise, we have a little, they have a lot. We have little teeth, they have big ones. If we're going to survive, we've got to listen to what they think is so, and we've got to give it back. We've got to fall in line. We've got to do what they say do. Little fish can also decide to deceive the big fish. And for them, this deception is an ethically valid thing. They could say the big fish have such power and pose such danger to us that if we were open with them about everything, they try to shut stuff down about us that is dear to us that they shouldn't. So we'll give them some of what they want so they can go on and swim about their own business. But behind what we give them, we have our life. We have what is sold for us. For some options, little fish will deceive in order to survive. Also, little fish can fear big fish. They can take on such anxious and trauma-producing, move into such anxious and trauma-producing spheres that to operate out of their own identity becomes something that is very hard for them to do. Fear can be a deep motivating option to take for little fish. And akin to fear, almost like a close cousin, is hate. If fear means I will not be myself because it is dangerous, then in some regards, hate will follow. Hate towards the big fish, but also hate towards oneself for not being able to say, that is not me, this is me. And I did not protect others who are like me the way I wish I had the whatever it is to do that. Little fish have options, and the big fish are posing dangers. There is another one to these four, and that's the withdrawal. Little fish can withdraw from big fish and either be passive or resist. Either way is an expression of withdrawal. Well, like big fish, little fish also think that addressing racism or other sins or whatever is both personal and interpersonal. But little fish also know there are cultural things as well as systemic things. To become more anti-racist, I think your congregation has got to function across all four of those spheres: personal, interpersonal, cultural, and systemic, in order to make the headway you need to make. That's the picture. Here's some things we do about it. This resource list I'm going to share with you has 3 different kinds of resources to it: things to read, things to do, and networks for your journey. This list is not a prioritized list. This does not do the first thing first, do the last thing last. No priority to this list at all. We suggest that you assist your church to do perhaps 2 to 4 things from this list or any other list you build simultaneously. Do them at the same time. The efforts work synergistically. They are far less impactful when done individually. It's just the way it seems to work. So, some things to read. And I'm using read perhaps because my generation relates that way. We think about articles, we think about blogs, we think about books, but there's also, podcasts, there's also vlogs, there's also YouTube videos, there's also a whole other range of ways. TikTok, I watch my grandchildren connect through TikTok and through music and through dance and things of that sort. I have a friend who lives in another state. Her pieces deals with the arts and with different kinds of dance. However you do it, form a community or a congregational, let's call it a club. Go into whatever you go into, identify several important takeaways and implement them. So I'm just going to focus on some articles right now. Here's one. And if you got the email that James Boone sent out to you, these three articles I think were probably referenced in that. One is why I stopped talking about racial reconciliation and started talking about white supremacy by Erna Kim Hackett. Came out last year. In fact, all three of these resources came out last year. It's an important piece, not so much because it talks about that dynamic in the title, but it really kind of unpacks some assumptions that we in the church make about the elements involved with becoming anti-racist and addressing things like white supremacy. Short article, very good article. Here's a longer one by the same person, Anti-Black Spiritual Formation. We tend not to talk about how spiritual formation or discipleship is really anti any group of people. But Erna breaks this article out, that starts with a conversation she had with a white pastor who spoke about, why are you talking about race and racism? There's something all wrong and broken about that. Listen to read her analysis about the fact that a lot of our spiritual formation, a lot of our discipleship, even is about how to be anti-Black, anti-reconciliation, anti-racist. Let's share a bit about Erna. She's a woman of color. She's a leader. And she does a lot of serious work with racial justice, white supremacy, and about Jesus. Erna's a pastor, a theologian. She's an influencer, blogger. She equips leaders. Well, here's the third article. It's a bit different than Erna's. It's called, What Can America Learn from South Africa About National Healing? This article is a conversation between the author, who is Puerto Rican, and a psychologist who is a Black South African. That psychologist coordinated the victims' public testimonies for South Africa's Truth and Reconciliation work under Nelson Mandela. They discussed the shortcomings of telling truth, when telling truth greatly outshines reconciliation. It's a fascinating, powerful read. It will help you understand some of the differences between things like cultural agility and diversity and reconciliation as we think of it, as opposed to how do you actually get into it and make right the injustices that have been done. It's a great read. Here are three books that I recommend to you. And again, there are many great books. I had problems trying to pick three for you. Here's the first of the three. Me and White Supremacy. Subtitle, Combat Racism, Change the World, and Become a Good Ancestor by Leah Saad. Layla's book is really a practical guide to assist white people to examine white privilege and white supremacy in their own lives. Layla Saad is a woman of color. She's a best-selling author, an anti-racism educator, speaker, and she's a podcast host. I really encourage you to connect with Layla's podcast and spend some time with that. I think you'll find it fruitful. Here's another book, Stamped, Racism, Anti-Racism, and You, by Jason Reynolds and Ibram X. Kendi. This little book looks at ways that racism is embedded in economics and politics and in everyday life from a racial ethnic perspective. It's not exactly a history book, but it does take us through the historical development and evolution of how racism is baked into so many things that affect our everyday lives. It's not written from a scholarly perspective. It's interesting that Jason Reynolds is an African American man who's also a best-selling author primarily of young adult and middle school student audiences. The book is somewhat pitched for them. Ibram Kendi is an African American award-winning author. He's a professor at Boston University, a historian, an anti-racist advocate who has been named by Time magazine to their 100 most influential people of 2020 list. I would say regarding Ibram, before I actually knew about him and read about him, many of my roads of research led to him eventually. Great book, great person to research and follow. Finally, White Fragility. Why It's So Hard for White People to Talk About Racism by Robin DiAngelo. Robin's book is motivated out of personal experience. She is a white woman. And she talks about her own sort of coming to as she explored her own defensive instincts and reactions in question about race and racism. And she helps people in that book to do the same for themselves. As I said, she's a white woman, she's an author, she's a consultant, and she's a facilitator on matters related to analysis and to whiteness. I want to make a special note about these people that I mentioned. Hackett, Saad, Reynolds, and Kendi are millennials. DiAngelo is a baby boomer. Martise and Gobodo Medekeza, pardon me for that, are of the builder generation. This is an intergenerational effort. I encourage you, as you help your congregations to become more anti-racist, do it intergenerationally, both in terms of the resources you use and the people that you involve. Some things that you can do. Those are some things you can read. Here's some things you can do. One thing is there's a resource out there. It's just called Diversity Conversation Flashcards. The title is What Stands Between Us. This little 400 card deck was developed by Lee Mun-Hwa. The deck assists persons to engage in meaningful conversations they would otherwise not have, either because they might feel personally rejected if they raise the questions, or because they might say something inappropriate that might offend. I use these cards a lot in some of the one-to-one experiences that I've had or group things that I've had. I'm going to mention Sankofa journeys. I've used them on Sankofa journeys as well. Lee is a Chinese American. He's an internationally renowned documentary filmmaker, educator, and diversity advocate. Check out his organization's website, stirfryseminars.com. There is a huge number of documentaries and other things that is available for purchase that can help you, can help your congregation, can help your community become more anti-racist. Just to give you an example of some of the questions that this card deck has. Some of the cards are written to be asked by people of color of a white person. Other cards are written for white persons to ask a person of color. So, how do you explain racism to your children? How do you comfort them? A white person might ask a person of color. A person of color might say, what is hard for you being white? A white person might ask, so how do you feel to be torn between your culture and the majority culture? A person of color might ask, why do you think that being colorblind is a good thing? The role of the questioner is simply to ask the question, and maybe to ask a clarifying question, not to engage in a dialogue, but to ask the question. The role of the speaker, the listener, the receiver of the question is to reflect on what is so for that person, what that person's truth is, and to share it as openly as possible. Diversity conversation flashcards. Sankofa journeys are another resource to consider using. They were originated by the Evangelical Covenant Church and were adopted for use by the Reformed Church in America. Sankofa journeys are high impact experiences that typically pair a person with another person of a different race. And together in a group, they visit people and places that will shed light on what is so perhaps historically, but also on themselves with regards to race, their own faith, and their own personal life journeys. Sankofa journeys, here's some of the factors involved with it. Any number of people can journey together. Journeys can occur in your own town or your own city. It can occur across your state, or you can take a journey into different parts of your own country. There are many people and organizations who can assist you with planning your Sankofa journey. Some are racial justice groups. There are libraries that are in your town that you can go to, and librarians can help you find resources. Perhaps your town has a historical society. There are colleges and universities that have staff or professors who can help you discover pathways to take and people to meet. Perhaps your denomination has resources that are available. But also, you have as resources persons who simply live as anti-racists. You want to structure your journey to visit places of current importance, as well as perhaps historical importance regarding race and racism. And along the way, meet people, individuals, who, because they have gone through it, or in our language here today, who have become anti-racist. They can help your group sharpen and focus their experiences. Also along the journey, watch pertinent movies, documentaries. When I led Sankofa journeys, and I did, 13, 14, 15 of them with the Reformed Church in America, we watched movies and documentaries. And then we broke them down and talked about them afterwards with some critical questions. You want to foster discussions among the pairs. Some things you want to do large group, but some things just in the intimacy and the safety of each person's partner. And finally, maybe keep people focused on their feelings and emotions. As I said earlier, many of us who are male tend to be much more in our heads, and we want to say, well, I think, and hear them speak, and then say, okay, that's great. I'm really grateful you shared that. Say more now about what you feel. And it's okay if you struggle with that, but say more about what you feel. Because that's where I think, maybe that's an assumption of mine, I think when you're wrestling with what you feel, you are wrestling with the greatest areas of resistance to change and potential for change. Help your people stay challenged and focused on their faith, on how they live, and about what they assume to be so about people of their races and other races that are different from them. couple other things about Sankofa journeys. The experiences can last over several consecutive days, and the journeys that I led were that way. But the journeys can also occur, you spend a few hours one day this week, a few hours one day next week, or you could do it perhaps on a monthly basis, a few hours one day, 1 month, and the next month. I would encourage you not to do it less frequently than that, because the intensity of the experience is likely to really lessen at that point. This taps into something that I shared earlier about what are my assumptions. Resist allowing Sankofa to simply be a powerful event or merely a personal or interpersonal matter. Ensure that it serves your understanding and your goals for anti-racism. And again, that definition, that working definition, to expose and eradicate racist ideas wherever they are encountered, including in yourself. This is a link where you can go to the Evangelical Covenant Church and view their numbers of resources that they have about how they use Sankofa journeys. Next, you want to listen and engage with local people on matters that they say require anti-racist responses. I think that this action of listening to engaging with local people may be the one that can assist your congregation the most with becoming more anti-racist, particularly if you live in a racially diverse town or city. Develop a congregational diet for relating to and allying with church members and geographic community members. Take their lead and pick up things that you can do together to make right. That's the positive side of this particular recommendation. But there is a downside, and it's a difficult one. This action is also likely to be the most difficult one for your congregation to negotiate. You recall our slide on big fish, little fish, that dynamic? People who are white tend to have different by internal I mean among white people, discussions and assumptions about trustworthiness than do people of color. The matter of trustworthiness across racial ethnic lines cannot be overstated as being a dynamic to be reckoned with. You've got to understand that we stand in different places. You've got to understand that what we say may not truly reflect the level of trust we bestow. You've got to work on that. You've got to work together on that, to identify it, to explore it, to break it down, to confirm if you've got what level of trustworthiness, and to be honored. I just want to say one more thing about that. We often want to say, you should trust me. You should trust me. And I contend that's the wrong question. The question should be, how have I proven trustworthiness to you? How have I proved trustworthiness to you? If we make that change in question, and we are diligent towards proving our trustworthiness through the standards of the other, I think we can go a long ways towards becoming more anti-racist. Many places that I've noticed where congregations want to begin is that they want to have a pastor, their pastor have a relationship with a pastor of another church who is also of a different race. And I think that's good, and I've helped to initiate and encourage such things. But there's a caveat to that. The goal is not to build strong personal relationships with pastors. The goal is to grow anti-racist congregations. That relationship with a pastor is the front edge of the matter. It's not the body of the matter. Don't elongate, make the front edge go too long. Bring the body of Christ along with you as you go forward. Here's the fourth recommendation, and then I think I'll go into my last part of my presentation here before we open for questions and answers and conversation. Communicate with at least 2 other networks to find other churches that model anti-racism. Our goal is, how do we help our congregation to become more anti-racist? Let's see if we can find other congregations that are on that journey too, but are a little bit further down than we are. Reach out to them, develop relationships with them, absorb their lessons learned and the outcomes that they work towards, and decide what you're going to do with your congregation. Here's a couple of places that you might look. One is the Christian Community Development Association, or you can check them out at ccda.org. For an annual minimal fee of $120, you can review your online courses, but you can also access their membership lists. Contact people on those lists who are anti-racism activists. Learn from them, grow with them. And another is something that you may not see many other places. There's a small collection of congregations located in and around Washington, D.C., called the Inward-Outward Communities of the Church of the Savior. That group, the Inward-Outward group, are small, micro congregations, and they emphasize throughout their discipleship and throughout their outreach anti-racism and other aspects of life as they help people grow to become more like Jesus. Every one of their churches is intentionally multiracial, men and women in leadership, people of different socioeconomic groups intentionally sharing leadership, learning together. Whatever barriers and isms are really important for the average everyday church, they have been intentional about not being that, breaking that down, and embedding all of that stuff. I'm not saying that right. Embedding discipleship, becoming more like Jesus in all of that. Really encourage you to reach out to that group. I've been in connection with them 3 or 4 times over my years, have visited them twice, and have asked them to participate in some of the work that I've done in my work with the Reformed Church in America. Really grateful for them as a resource. Finally, here are some networks you might consider. There's a group called the Racial Justice Institute Network of the Shriver Center of Poverty Law. There are 2 things I really, really like about that group. One is that it's a national leadership development program. And secondly, as is the case with many millennial and Gen Z things, they see things intersectionally. They talk about racial equity as a commitment to anti-poverty advocacy. I encourage you to look them up. Here's another one. To join and participate in a movement such as Showing Up for Racial Justice, or SURGE. That's the website. SURGE is really a national network of chapters, local chapters and local affiliates and groups and individuals who are working together for 2 purposes. One is to undermine white supremacy, and the other is to work for racial justice. Through community organizing and mobilizing in education, SURGE is primarily interested in moving white people to act as part of a multiracial majority for justice with passion and to do it with accountability. They have built into their core values and the structures that those core values feed all those principles. I first became aware of SURGE when I visited Charlottesville, Virginia, shortly after the Unite the Right rallies, around which there were, well, as we maybe all know, there was a violent protest to that, and a person was killed. I went there to learn more about what happened in Charlottesville, learned about SURGE there, and then subsequently brought 2 other groups of people to Charlottesville to see that. What they learned about, they didn't learn about SURGE, but they learned about how that local network of SURGE churches really did good work. Finally, join and participate with Black Lives Matters. And that's their website. That is a global organization in the US, Canada, and the UK. But I've heard about their impact globally in India and other countries around the world. Their mission is to eradicate white supremacy and to build local power to intervene in violence that's inflicted on Black communities by state and vigilantes. They've done a lot to combat and counter acts of violence and so forth, and to create space for Black life and for other people's lives and how they imagine things to be. I recently began working with the city government that I work in on a sort of a short-term contract. It has to do with the business community here. Interesting. The white people who launched this initiative started to observe what was happening in our local Black Lives Matters-led demonstration, began to think for their business district, how much at home do people who don't live here feel when they come into our community to purchase items or to eat or to congregate or to participate in the assets that our community has. There's many things that Black Lives Matter has generated in terms of healthy response in our communities, both personally and interpersonally for sure, but also culturally and systemically. So those are networks that I have, and that's the nature of my PowerPoint. I want to turn over to, I put this PowerPoint together in this way because I wanted people to be able to take it and decide to share it in a direct way without having to struggle with, oh, what did he say or what was the information? I wanted this to be almost a train the trainer piece where you could take information and run with it yourself. Thank you. Back to you, James.
So I'm going to open the floor up for questions and discussion, and I'm going to call on Paul Jansen and ask him to unmute and share with us.
Okay, let's see. Is this working?
Yes.
Okay. Earl, I'm in the first place, I am extremely, extremely, extremely grateful for what you brought. Very practical, very helpful, very spot on. And I'm not going to follow that up with some kind of like, on the other hand, so don't sweat it. I do wonder if there is a sort of foundational layer of work that needs to be done in predominantly white congregations to even begin to have discussions, to avoid the kind of, at some point you talked about the assumptions of trust and all that sort of, those things that I'm sure you've seen hundreds of times over the course of your career. So I'm wondering if there's some, or maybe it's in one of the resources, but I just didn't quite catch that it's there. Some of that work that makes it possible for a predominantly white congregation to even begin to be faithful conversation partners.
Thank you for that question, Paul. I think it's a great question. I believe that you strike where the iron is hot. Look for the coalition of the willing. Look for people who perhaps evidence in their everyday lives a propensity for this kind of life and this kind of work. And you begin by talking with them, whether it's 2 or 10 or whatever the number is, you begin by talking with them. You begin by helping them explore, I think, what is so for them? What were some of their, what are some of their questions? What are some things that they feel might take them some next step in their lives? And begin to think about how to help them take those next steps and work with them on when and how to invite other members of the congregation into that journey with them. So I would say first, where's the coalition of the willing? Where's the iron hot? And begin to work that way.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Ben, go ahead. And
Earl, thank you so much for this. It was eye-opening, and I really appreciated the frame of the big fish, little fish. I'm the music director at First Reformed Church in New Brunswick. And First Reformed Church has a very long history of going either one way or the other when it comes to dealing with race. I mean, the information is available to learn about how much damage we've done in terms of race relations, and also what we've tried to done throughout what we had tried to do throughout the 20th century to repair those relationships. So I wonder how much is an awareness of the history of one's congregation valuable in this process? Is it valuable for a white congregation to dig deeply into its archives and find out how we may have caused pain in the first place in order to start this conversation with the congregation? I'm wondering what your thoughts are about awareness of history of one's personal congregation.
I think that's a fascinating question, Benjamin. Thank you for asking that. I love history. I try to be a lifelong learner in a variety of topics. So for me, that question, my personal side is to say, absolutely. The more you know about a topic, the better equipped you may be to deal with that topic. A caveat to it is to keep in mind that becoming anti-racist does not depend on how much history you have retained, does not depend on how much your people lament a particular organizational involvement, although that is important. Becoming anti-racist is not that. That is a very inward-looking piece where, again, from my own assumptions, the real work of anti-racists is to make things different out here in the everyday lives of everyday people, including members, neighbors, and so forth. So I don't have a yes or no thought about your question at all, Benjamin. I would say certainly, by all means, knowing that history is important for a variety of reasons, including you don't want to repeat that history. There may be people in the environment who know of that history and hold that history against you. So if you're not aware of that, right, you may not be able to address that. That may be one of those unconscious blocks on the part of members of your church. They may go forward unconsciously aware that that block is there. So you want them to know that it's there. You want them to be aware of it. And you want them to also reckon with the idea that people out there may know some of it. But you don't want them to stay focused on that. You want them to focus much more on everyday life and on where people are at and what's the next step we need to take going forward. I hope that helps.
Thank you.
okay, we've sorted out David McMaster's issues only in finding out that David McMaster is actually Terry Troya on David McMaster's telephone. Terry is always 3 steps ahead of the rest of us. Those of us who've worked with Terry before know that. Anyway, she has typed her question in. Have you had experience with the UCC anti-racism curriculum, or do you know how to get it?
I have, first off, hi, Terry. I hope you're doing well. I have experience with the UCC curriculum. I think that it is very powerful, very helpful. I think people who work with it will certainly go down a really healthy pathway with it. The second part of her question, could you read that again, please, James?
Do you know how to get the curriculum?
The last time I tried to do that, I did two things. One was I went to their website and found it on their website. The other was that I called one of my counterparts, someone who is involved with social or racial justice in their denominational office for it and for instruction on how to access it. I haven't looked up there in quite a while for it. I would encourage you, if you cannot find it on their website, to call someone in the denominational office who provides denominational leadership on racial or social justice and see what they can do to help.
Anybody else? Other questions, comments, discussion? Leslie Morrow, go ahead and unmute.
Good morning. Mr. James, sort of a kind of a probably ignorant basic question. At my church, I know there are a few people who say, I don't see color. I don't see color. How do we engage with folks who don't even acknowledge that maybe they do see color? It's like this denial, basically. What do we do? How do we start a conversation without putting anyone on the defense?
Thanks for that question, Leslie. It makes me smile in some regards because of some experiences that I had that made me furious when it first came to me. And I had to sort of realize the context of the person saying it. My context was I was in a sort of a far Midwestern state. I think I recognized one or two other Black people as I was driving through town. And I was speaking at a church, and afterwards there was a group of men. We were sitting around kind of talking and sharing, and they were all smiling. And, I felt kind of watchful, perhaps. One of the men said, this is really great. You are just like us. And I said, what do you mean? He says, well, I'm relating to you like I relate to any other white person. And I flashed angry at that point. And so I appreciate your question. I think it's akin to saying, if the persons that you're thinking about are women, how would you feel if a group of men were to come up to you and say, you know what, you're just like one of the guys? Or if a man went up to a group of women and they said to him, you remind me of my sister. You're like one of the girls, man. That's great. No. When you take that thing into other demographics, it makes no sense there at all, does it? I would start by taking it to a demographic difference like that and saying, what does that do for you to hear that? And then to hear them talk about that, and then to say, so why do you think it works? This color blindness demographic works when it comes to race and racism. There is grounds for offense. There's grounds for being taken aback. There's grounds for anger flashing on that. And there is grounds for the range of little fish responses. Okay, that's how you see me. I capitulate. Or, all right, I'm going to lie to you because that's your context and it won't get any better than that. Or I'm gonna walk. Forget you. I'm gonna walk. The little fish is going to have a response, just like if a group of guys went to a woman and said, you know what, you're just like all my other guys that I hang out with. There's nothing about you that's a woman, or vice versa. You're like all the girls that I know and care for. No. I would start with something like that and try to set up some sort of an emotional reaction to them before you launch into, let's take this apart piece by piece. If they're not somehow or other thrown off balance a little bit, being colorblind is going to be a default because many of the people they know probably also default to colorblindness. Does that help?
Yes, very much. Yes, very much so. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thanks for that question.
Okay. Mary McIntosh posted a question in the Q&A, and so I'm going to invite her to have a chance to ask her question herself.
Hello, Mr. James. Nice to see you. I'm
Good to hear
wondering,
you.
after the many different events last spring, our church in Bronxville, New York, formed a committee on racial justice. And there has been a great deal of divisiveness within the committee as the work has gone forward. People who profess to have great hearts and want to do things in local communities, but a lot of division, particularly over support for Black Lives Matter. And the sense among some that Black Lives Matter is a political organization, and others that if we can't support that as a church, who are we as Christians? Just love your advice about how to handle that sort of conflict within a committee of people who are, as you say, supposedly the coalition of the willing. These are people who willingly signed up to be a part of this committee.
Yeah. I like the, thanks first, Mary, for your question. I recognize and I feel the challenge in what you're faced with. When the term Black Lives Matter first started to emerge, there was a whole rash of pieces that went along with it, for and against it. The most recent one that is out there that I feel like is really strong and helpful is to say, if you say Black lives don't matter, then all lives can't matter. Black lives matter has to be included in with Blue Lives Matter and White Lives Matter and Brown Lives Matter and all of that sort of thing. So how can you assert the whole if you will not hold to the part? So I like that formulation that all lives can't matter if Black lives don't. Mm-hmm. There are political things, there are religious political things that have castigated that movement in certain sorts of ways. But tell them to come up with another phrase. If they can't say and embrace the phrase Black Lives Matter, come up with another phrase that does not include Black lives. I don't know where they would go with that. And I don't know that we deal these days with two totally different sets of facts, or orientations around what is a fact. I don't know, I have no idea how we all get on the same page regarding some of this stuff. No idea how we do it. The culture wars affect our congregations like they affect everything else. I think the best that you can do is to say, it's not that you have to defend the movement, it's you defend the principle. If the principle is not defendable, then you don't have common ground, period. You just have, a evidence of how deeply penetrated the group has been by culture war. And I don't know what to suggest or encourage with regards to that, except to say, to ask, do you believe all lives matter? Of course I do. I don't think, some Christians, I think, will say, no, I don't believe all lives matter. But the ones that do say that, how can you hold to that if Black lives don't? And then what are your tangible things for what you say Black lives matter for? Just like, what are the tangible things you say all lives matter for? I think that's a great question. It's a question that's not just in, as you say, your church, it's questions in families. I know a number of families, and maybe you do too, there's a line drawn down the center, and these families could be permanently broken over that question that you raised. I think I'm talking like this, trying to figure it out, figure out what to say. I think the best thing I can think of right now, Mary, is to encourage you to get people to try to, can all lives matter if Black lives don't?
Thank you so much. We have a meeting coming up soon. One of my people on the committee was also on the beginning of the call. She's no longer, but it's been highly emotional, as you can imagine, and that's really helpful. That's kind of where we've been trying to come out, but you've given us a lot more thought. Thank you.
You're very welcome.
I'd also remind you, Mary, and others who might have committees like that at their churches where folks from the committee couldn't be here with us today. This recording will be available on the Reformed Church Center's webpage and on the Facebook page where the event was, and on NBTS's regular Facebook page in a couple of days. And in fact, when you get the follow-up email tomorrow, you will get a link for the place on the Reformed Church Center page where you can find that. Stacy Pierce wanted to come into the conversation. Stacy, go ahead and unmute.
Hello, and thank you so much, Earl James, for being with us today and sharing your wisdom and time and just your wonderful presence with us today. I'm so grateful for you. I'm part of a church that has two parts, an English-speaking congregation, a Spanish-speaking congregation. And we are trying to do some work around how to live in a more unified way as a beloved community of God's people and find points of connection where we've been functioning pretty separately up until this point in time. And I know that there are other churches in the RCA that are multicultural, multiracial, even different languages spoken. But I wondered if you had any particular resources to point out for a church in that's in my situation for trying to grow in our unity together and our relationships together.
Yes, thanks for that question. There is a church in New Jersey called the Community Church of Newport. Their pastor is Reverend Dawn Seaman. 2 or 3 different times I took collections of people over to that church to spend time with Dawn because of the nature of a relationship that her church had with some others. At that time, I don't know what their current situation is, but at that time, Community Church of Seaport, which was a small white RCA church, was the host to 2 other churches of 2 different denominations. One was bilingual, English-Spanish, I believe, and the other was predominantly Spanish-speaking. They had a multi-level partnership among those 3 churches, where the pastors got together regularly for prayer, but also for dividing up the bills and also for how do we do life together. And how they did life together in some regards was, what are some of the skill sets that some people in your church have? Whether it was regards to buildings or chocolate, whatever it is, what are the skill sets? And how can we share within this fellowship of congregations people who have those various skill sets? Dawn was sort of the first among equals among that. She would not say she was the lead pastor among the 3. She said very clearly she's the first among equals and talked a lot about what that meant. They did some of the usual things that you would expect, like holding periodic worship services together. But it was for them, the monthly life of doing church together that where they really lived and moved. I would encourage anybody, but you're asking the question, Stacey, I'd encourage you to reach out to Dawn Seaman, who's pastor of the Community Church of Keyport in New Jersey. And if you can, spend some time over there. Bring some people with you if you can go over there and visit. There may be other examples of churches also in the RCA or in other denominations that have that kind of relationship. Where they are, I would really encourage you to go and model them. View them, get close to them. Don't model them from the point of view of copying them, but model them for saying, what is the lessons learned and how do we customize it to where we are? But one other thing that I think Dawn shared with us that they have some sort of, I will call it a covenant, or it's not a contract, I would say it's a covenant or a feeling of what a written statement of what our fellow feeling is together. There's another church that comes to mind also, this one is in New Jersey, Reformed Church of Closter. For many years, that congregation has had a white host church with a Korean church in there. They have had a written document, a written covenant that in English and in Korean that outlines what the nature of their relationship has been. I don't know who the pastor is there currently. I believe it is the church, the RCA's coordinator for Pacific and Asian American ministries, and Young Kim. I would encourage you to contact either N. Young through the denominational office or contact that church directly to see what their model looks like. I hope that's helpful.
It is. Thank you so much for giving me some connection points. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
For those who try to contact on Young, her email is eykim@rca.org. That's the way to find her. Liz Hance. Okay, go ahead and unmute, Liz.
Got it now. So my question is, okay, and my church is First Reformed Church in New Brunswick, and as many churches, particularly the ones that are urban types of churches, okay, we are seeing our older original congregation eventually dwindle, and we are hoping to continue to grow with more people from within our community, and they don't look like us, and they don't have our life experience. Do you have suggestions on, I mean, and clearly there's a number of us already listening here because our pastor Lillian encouraged all of us, if we could, to try to listen in on this or on this webinar. But do you have suggestions for those of us that are now, I don't want to use the word appeal because that's not what a church is, but we're trying to bring our message, our mission, okay, to people who do not look like us and who do not share our life experiences. What do we need to be doing for ourselves, okay, in order to prepare for that?
First, hello, Liz. How are you? Good to see you. Good to hear you again.
Hi, Earl. Nice to see you.
Thank you for that question. I think that's an important question. It raises some questions about how can the church adopt models of ministry that it may not be so familiar to it. I'm aware of, I happen to have lived for several years in walking distance of your church, so I kind of know where what's around that area. Almost across the street from your church is an Episcopal church, primarily Black, I think primarily Caribbean. And further down the street from your church, there is a United Methodist church that is a multiracial church. I think further up the street from your church, there's a Lutheran church that has perhaps a different ethnicity, perhaps white ethnicity than your church has. I think one thing that is possible is that if your pastor were to reach out to the pastors of those churches around a cup of coffee or around a virtual cup of coffee. For every Sunday at 5:30, my wife hosts a Zoom dinner meeting with everybody in her family from New Jersey, New York, North Carolina, and Georgia. And they all get together for an hour or so of dinner time together, just talking and laughing and engaging, whatever. Perhaps if your pastor did something like that and invited those pastors from that area, that might be a place to start with regards to some things. I also know that your church has a wonderful, wonderful ministry that exists on your premises, brings in battered women, displaced women from around the community and provides housing for them. That area of where your church is located in, Liz, I think is rich for opportunity to connect with people, to begin that kind of a conversation and discussion. You're talking about a particular purpose. I don't know this about the other churches, but they may also find that there's some shared community, wider community, geographic community, that neighborhood concerns that they may share in common. Explore those, live into those kinds of things. That may be one way where the church can begin to do something along those lines.
Okay, Terry looks like she has another question. She has raised her hand. Let's see if she can answer. Terry, she's gone back to chat. Okay. She is asking, are there any biblical or other resources about a theology of difference? What is the moral imperative to engage with and build relationship with people different than yourselves?
At the top of our time together, James mentioned that he worked with me under a variety of different RCA banners that I was under. Missional Mosaic, Cultural Agility, so on and so forth. Remember that, James?
Yes.
Something that we put together was, and I can send this to you, Jay, if I can find it, I will send this to you. There were biblical expositions on certain biblical verses and stories that spoke to that. For example, off the top of my head, Revelations, I think it was Revelations 5 in particular, where there's this great crowd of heavenly beings, humans, other beings surrounding the throne, calling out to God, and John the Revelator is weeping deeply over this, and an angel comes to him, or an elder comes to him and says certain things. That gives him comfort. But one of the things that is really unique about that is that the only thing all these groups have in common, other than God's self, is Jesus. That's the only thing that brings them all to the table. And that's the only thing that makes all of them the same, that puts all of them on the same plane, is Jesus. There's a piece to that in terms of, yes, that's prophetic and about the future, but how do you prepare to live that way here and now? There are something on a different kind of a way. There's a set of verses in Isaiah 58, the first 12 verses in particular, that talk about God on the one hand and devout people on the other. And where God judges the devout, I mean, the devout people, they're really devout people. They are truly devout people. But God has problems with them. Their devotion does not suffuse, transform their ethics. They still are willing to fight people who are different than them. They are still willing to oppress people who have less resource than them. And God is judgmental about them. And Isaiah asks a question, is this the kind of fasting that I want, speaking for God? Well, that's not a question. It's a statement. God wants fasting that releases people from captivity, binds people together through certain things, feeds people who are without, clothes people without, shelters people who are unsheltered, etc. I think they're powerful things, and I can send you, James, some of the documents that we put together in trainings that we did around some of those biblical things, whether they are prophetic things or are wisdom statements from Proverbs or biblical statements from Jesus or New Testament prophetic statements from Revelations, or things that Paul said that there's no Greek or Gentile in Christ, where Christ does not recognize those kinds of differences. There are many, many things in Scripture that we can go to that highlight that. For whatever reason, we don't tend to get a steady diet of those those verses. Consequently, scriptural stories and tenets and values tend to not suffuse, tend not to penetrate a lot of the things that we're doing. Going back to Mary's question about how do we find peace on this committee, I think one way to find some peace, if depending on how this group views the power of Scripture to really influence the course of things, it's depending on that. If they can bring a lot of that to the table, and that sort of thing may help. This kind of feels like I'm giving you a rambling response. So I apologize that my response is not so crisp to that. But I think there's many, many things in Scripture that we could point to that we often don't think about and often don't relate to this question of addressing racism or anti-racism in particular.
While you were speaking, Earl, a few people also posted into the chat some resources that they've had experience with. So there's some ways we can resource one another. Okay, beyond words, count us in conversations that are happening, that are being done, coordinated between Liz Testa's Office of Women's Transformation and Leadership and the African American Black Council. If you go to rca.org and check and look for Beyond Words, I'm guessing that there will be something there that could link you to more information about that, or contact by email either Liz Testa or Pete Williams, who succeeded Earl at the African American Black Council.
Pete Watts.
Pete Watts. Thank you, Pete. Thank you. That will be helpful for you. It looks like we are at about the end of our conversation then. And it's been a wonderful conversation. I want to thank everyone who has been chiming in and participating, everybody who's just been listening, dropping things into the chat. And I especially want us to give a big round of thanks to Earl for being here with us and guiding us through this conversation and helping us think about these things in new ways. Thank you, everybody. And I look forward to seeing you at another Reformed Church Center event very soon. Have a good weekend. Take care.